Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is the second of 3 lectures on environmental assessment for strategic planning. You may recall that the first video lecture was about assessment of economic conditions that can affect firms' performance potentials. In this second video, we'll take a look at market conditions. In strategic planning, it's important to gather evidence with which to make strategic decisions. And as I mentioned during our last meeting, strategic management textbooks don't do a very good job of explaining what strategic planners and strategic managers do to gather evidence with which to make strategic decisions. And in particular, those textbooks do a particularly weak job of exploring economic impacts and market effects and methods of assessing market conditions for strategic planning purposes. So the purpose of this second lecture is to demonstrate some of the methods and approaches that are taken to assess market business conditions. Now, it's almost impossible to cover that subject exhaustively because there are so many markets and so many ways of exploring markets. Each industry serves specific markets or a collection of markets, and each firm elects to serve a unique collection of markets, which may or may not be similar to markets served by other firms in the same industry. So this is a complicated subject. And the best thing I can do is simply go through some of the more abundant, more frequently examined market conditions and drivers of market conditions so that you can begin to form your own thoughts about how evidence can be gathered to drive demand for the products and services that your firm might offer. So with that, let me get started with the videos here. And as you will recall, I sometimes have a little difficulty with that. So far, so good. And there we are. So we're talking about market drivers and trends. And the scope of what we're going to talk about in this video includes trends in population and demographics, trends in individuals' economic outlooks, and what drives their economic outlooks, their sentiment. And then we'll take a look at some real-life implications of population and demographics and consumer sentiment insofar as specific industries and specific product categories are concerned. So first of all, because of the times that we're living in, I'll make a few remarks about the implications and impacts that the coronavirus pandemic has had, because that has changed everything in consumer marketing. Then we'll move on to take a look at a few industries that have been demonstrated positive outlooks where growth is continuing, and others where that's not the case, where the outlook is weaker. And we'll wind up talking about some differences between marketing conditions in different parts of the world. again, without getting into excruciating detail. All right, so let's have a look at population and demographics. And the first thing to note is that age groups differ over time. So here you can see a graph that shows changes in age group populations between 1939 and 2010. And you can see that the fastest growing age group and the largest age group up until about the turn of the century was in the peak earning year groups, 25 to 44 years old. But you can see there at the as the end of the century occurred and the new millennium began, that the 45 to 64-year-old group was growing faster and reaching the same size as the 25 to 44-year-old group. Now, I hope that that does not surprise too many of you, because if you take that 25 to 44-year-old group and simply increase its age by 20 years, that's the 45 to 64-year-old group. And so what we see is quite simply the red line becoming the black line as 20 years pass. Another interesting trend is the blue line, where we can see that the seniors, the older members of the population, seem to be growing fairly rapidly. So now let's take a look at the trends and outlook for the 40 years from 2010 to 2050, which of course includes the time that we are in today. There's that 25 to 44-year-old group, and it's still growing, but the real fast growth group had been 45 to 64, and it's kind of leveled off. But now the seniors, 65 and older, are growing most rapidly of all, and appear to be the group where, if you happen to have products that or services that appeal to them, right now there's a pretty substantial rate of growth, rapid rate of growth in demand for those products and services, because those people in this country anyway are growing very rapidly. But we can't forget the 45 to 64-year-old group either, because if we add those to the seniors, we get a really big group. On the other hand, we can see that the growth rates for younger people in the United States are not nearly as rapid. You want to be careful here, by the way. The number of years between 25 and 44 is 20, the same for 45 to 64. But when we get to 5 to 13, we only have 9 years. 18 to 24, we have 7, and so forth. So under 5, not many years at all. So no surprise that those age groups are smaller than those with 20 years in their brackets. Nevertheless, there's no doubt about it that senior citizens group seems to be the one where the action is today. Now let's take a look at the way in which population age groups, particularly the younger ones, are created. And that's through marriage, of course, at least to some extent. And we can see that marriage rates have really declined in recent years, since about 1978, perhaps. And then here, as we approach experience the coronavirus, you can see that marriage rates have done another small decline, but the decline, in fact, has been going on for some time. And this has a lot to say for marketing purposes. First of all, married couples have different demands, different requirements, different desires to purchase goods and services than people who are not married, don't they? So there's a lot in this chart because it speaks very specifically to changes in demand for products and services among younger people. By the way, whereas this chart is for the United States, here we see the same thing happening in Europe. So the chart we just looked at is not unique to the United States. The yellow line indicates the marriage rate in the 28 European countries. Dealing with Europe always is a problem because we either have to deal with all 28 countries individually or deal with them as a group. And of course, what's going on inside the group differs dramatically between geographic regions, countries, sizes, and so forth. Nevertheless, we can see that the birth rate is really declining, and the divorce rate, the blue line, which we didn't see in the prior slide, but we will later, but it's increasing. And here it is in China. China is the largest country in the world with respect to population. For those of you who have had classes with me before, you know already that the impact of China on numerous markets has been quite dramatic. For instance, there are more automobiles produced and purchased in China than anywhere else in the world, including the United States. Many people still are unaware of that. But China's economy is now the largest in the world. It's larger than the economy of the United States. And we'll get into that later as well. And you can see that in China, even in China, there's an increasing divorce rate. But most importantly, there's a decreasing marriage rate. The Pew Research Group publishes a large amount of research on this and similar topics. And so I've chosen some of Pew's publications and extracts from them simply to illustrate the specifics of some of these trends that I just mentioned. So here is a chart that shows that the marriage rate is a little bit lower in urban areas than suburban and rural areas, and that depending upon the ethnic group that you're talking about, the marriage rates will be a little higher or lower among the African American community. And similarly, the percent of births that occur to unmarried mothers, children out of wedlock, if you will, is highest among the African American community, but and lowest among the Caucasian community, and in the middle of those two is the Hispanic community. So again, these trends are not meant to have any implications on values. There's no good and bad here. These are just statistics. But these statistics tell us a lot about who it might be, or the people who might make up market groups, market segments, and the kind of products or services that they would or would not tend to demand. And as you can imagine, the goods and services demanded by different groups on this slide will in fact differ. This is an old trend, old chart that I have used many times. It's out of date, and I wish I could find an up-to-date version of it, but it still makes a pretty dramatic point. On the top chart, the yellow line represents people who never were married between 1960 and 2010. And you can see that during that period, the portion of people who were never married virtually doubled from 15 to 28%. Okay, less 2 points. Another item of interest is the portion of people who are divorced, which in 1960 was 5%, but by 2010 had become 14%, and today it's undoubtedly larger. So that portion has tripled. And if we add the two together, we have 20% who were never married in 1960, and the portion in 2010 had grown to 42%. In the middle, the light green consists of ladies who are widowed, and I don't include those in either of the earlier groups. They were married, they're not married now, so bless their hearts, they're in neither category. The portion that is married or was married dropped dramatically from about 3/4 in 1960 to only half in 2010. So there's some really major trends going on here, and those trends have continued. So everything you see on the right side of that chart, you should simply extend. Another interesting trend is the age at which people in this country marry. And you can see that there's an increasing trend in the ages at which people marry. They got married in 1960, right out of school, right out of college, or shortly after high school. And now, by 2010, men got married almost at age 30, at about age 29, and women between 26 and 27. So there are, again, some very definite trends. Among others, since the people who are getting married, first marrieds, are older, they probably have a little more money, and they can afford a higher quality of living or standard of living when they do get married. If they're both working, they can afford a lot more than people who first were married way back in 1960. Here are some more items from that graph, and I think I'm going to pay less attention than I sometimes do. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see that the number of newly married adults had declined from 2000 to 2010, 2006 to 2010. You can see that the portions that were married by different age groups also differed dramatically. The portion 18 to 24, the newly marrieds, the there weren't too many in the most recent in 2010 who recently had been married, but that portion was a lot larger back in 2010. I'm sorry, back in 2000. In any event, doggone, I'll get it right yet, back in 1960. So in 1960, 9%, 2010, 45%. You can see that those differences persisted throughout the age groups, certainly, and sort of leveled off by the middle age group. In the old days, about 86% of the population 35 to 44 years old was married, and today and by 2010 it was 62%. So really significant differences here. Let me move down. By the way, I made a sort of silly mistake. I copied the same panel twice. So the one in the middle here and the one on the bottom are the very same. And since the one on the bottom is bigger, let's look at it. And we can see that the folks who ever were married, whether they got divorced or not, back in 1960, 93%, but by 2010, 77%, about 3/4, and in the age, and that was at the middle age group, whereas in earlier ages, for instance, 25 to 29, there were really major differences. Virtually half the portion of folks married in 1960 were married in 2010. And so this raises a question, just what is the attitude about marriage do people intend not to get married? Do they think marriage is no longer a good idea? Is it obsolete? And in the panel at the lower left, you get some indication, but I don't think that's a very good chart. So I recreated it this way. And so the Pew Research Group, back when that survey was done, asked respondents whether marriage was becoming obsolete. And you can see that among younger folks, young adults, the portions were pretty high, over 40% in both the 18 to 29 and 30 to 49 year group. And even among adults over 65, the portion was about a third. This is a pretty significant trend, isn't it? If even when they're 65 years old, a third of the population thinks that marriage is obsolete, and almost half of younger adults do, then you can imagine that that is one explanation for why the marriage rate is declining. Now, what people do when they don't get married is another question, but we'll leave that for later. We can see that the folks who are college graduates, only about a quarter of those, a little more than a quarter actually, tend to believe that marriage is obsolete, whereas those who are just high school graduates are back up here in this 45% category. Now, this should not be surprising. When folks go to college, they have an opportunity to meet a mate. Many meet their spouses that way. And when they do get married, of course, they don't think it's obsolete anymore. We'll find out also that folks in that category tend to earn more money than folks who are not married. And of course, that's because they need to support their families. Here are a few more recent variations on that theme. As you can see, the portion waiting until they're older to get married has really gone up. The top line are the males and the bottom red line is females. But now the males are, remember in the last chart we looked at, I said that it was approaching 30%, and now it's pretty well there. I asked what people are doing if they don't get married, and of course one of the things they can do is just live together, and you can see that the portion of people doing that has increased somewhat, but not that much. Folks who are married at a young age, we spoke about before, but here's a more recent statistic. Some 59% of 18 to 34-year-olds were married back in 1978, but 40 years later in 2018, it had dropped to 29%. And here's that statistic that I mentioned a moment ago. The folks earning $40,000 or more, if they were married, 40% did. If they were unmarried, 20% did. And of course, the difference is due to the fact that once married, people have obligations. So another set of statistics that talks about these trends. In the upper left-hand corner, we see that the US population growth rate is declining. That's what the purple bars represent. And the yellow line represents births, and the blue line represents deaths. So the difference between those two lines is narrowing, and so the number of births, the growth of the population has declined as a result. And I should mention that the purple bars represent natural increases in population, the difference between birth and death. That's not the actual difference, though, because we have immigration to deal with. As a matter of fact, we can do that before we look at the others. You can see down here in the lower right hand that the natural increase in population is represented by the orange arrows, orange bars. And over time, including forecast into 2060, the proportion represented by natural increases, that is the difference between births and deaths, really gets a lot smaller. As a matter of fact, beginning in 2030, it's only 1%, and after that, it's less than 1%. So the blue lines represent immigration. And if it weren't for immigration, there wouldn't be much growth in the United States population at all. And we'll get into that a little more later because it's extremely important. Why so important? Because what people want to buy depends a great deal on their ethnic background, where they came from, if they moved to the United States, what their tastes and habits are. But the way in which we market to people who might have been born in another country could be much different than the way we market to natives. And as it turns out, that'll be quite important. Now, there are two other important graphs here. The first, I guess I can point out over here on the lower left, and that is, as you might imagine, just from what we've said so far, the portion of women who don't have children is also rising. The blue line represents women 30 to 34, and the red line represents women 35 to 33. So there seems to be some tendency for folks simply not to have children. For all of the reasons we've talked about, the chart in the upper right-hand corner is kind of interesting. First of all, please bear in mind that right now, let me just do this real quick. This is 2020. Okay. So that's where we are today. And so the orange line represents children under 18. And I'm not sure that people 18 years old deserve to be called children, but that's what the Census Department did in this graph. The blue line represents adults 65 years and older. And you can see that by about 2034, somewhere around there, the senior citizens will outnumber younger people. And this has a lot of implications, not least of which is for Social Security. But beyond that, again, if you're doing strategic planning for a company, the kind of markets that you either can or want to target will differ substantially in the next 15 years. So for market planning, that is a very significant trend. Okay, you've probably seen these population pyramids in the past, and in 1960, that's the way it looked. You can see that there was a little indentation in the 24 to 34-year-old group, something like that. But in any event, that represents the effects of World War II, which ended in 1945. If the pyramid, so-called, or the diagram on the right had been extended further up, we would have gotten a pyramid just the same shape as the one on the left. But what we see here now is that there is a much larger proportion of people who are 85 years and older. And so we'll be getting into that later, because that is look at the size of that bar. That's a big market segment. And again, if you're in the consumer products or consumer services business, you need to understand just what's going on there and whether there's an opportunity for your company to exploit the growth in that segment. Another interesting trend is the growth in millennials and who vote. And you can see that those who are older, 45 to 64 and 65 and older, are more likely to vote than younger age groups. In fact, it's only the 65 and over age group that was actually growing since 1996 in this graph. And this graph goes to 2016. So it's fairly recent. Now, why is that important? Because seniors, if they vote more often and there are more of them, you can just imagine that they are going to have greater political influence today and in the future than in the past. Consequently, legislators, if they want to be reelected, are going to be more responsive to folks in those age groups. Therefore, we're even more interested to know just what it is that they want to buy. Now, we mentioned earlier the significance of immigration. And this chart is quite recent. Incidentally, the charts up here were done by the U.S. Census Department. And now we're back to the Pew Research Group, which I should mention is a highly regarded, very reliable economic and market research firm. So you can see that something's going on with immigration in this country, and that is that the Hispanic population is growing quite rapidly. Now, the growth rates of that population segment are on the right side, and you can see that they've declined since pretty significantly since 2010, and the current administration, the Trump administration, as you probably know, has worked hard to limit illegal immigration and to control immigration. The anticipation is that the new Democratic administration will not be as rigorous in its enforcement of immigration policy, in which case we may move back to some of the growth rates over on the left, maybe not 3.5%, but perhaps 2.5%. Even though these growth rates have come down, they're still higher than any other category of immigrant, with the exception of Asians. And Asians don't make up nearly the population segment that Hispanics do. Next to Caucasians, Hispanics are the largest population group in the United States, representing just short of 19%. When this survey was done, I think it was 18.7, and I rounded. By 2030, the expectation was that that group would represent 21%. I'm guessing it'll be larger than that because of the change in immigration policies that should be expected. Where is this population, the Hispanic population, located most? And well, you probably could have guessed it, but it's California, Texas, and Florida. However, those are not the only states. You can see that Cook County, which is where Chicago is located, has a Hispanic population that represents 26% of the total. But and so, you know, we're not talking about just California, Texas, and Florida, but in fact, this is a trend occurring all over the United States. However, in California, it's really large. In Los Angeles, about 5 million people, about half the population of Los Angeles. If we come down to Riverside County, we've got another 1.25 million and 50%. If we come down to San Bernardino, all these are in Southern California, by the way, 1.2 million, over 50%. And Orange County, which is another county in Southern California, a third. So if you put all those together, you got a lot of people of Hispanic origin. And the significance of this is that marketing must be done in the Spanish language as well as English, and tastes of food, clothing, entertainment, a whole lot of consumer goods and services must respond to the preferences of this particular group. Similarly, in Texas, and here we see in Harris County, about 44%, down in Dallas, 41%. Miami, my golly, 69%. Almost 2 million people in 2019, and they represented almost 70% of Miami's population. So you are better rewarded if you advertise in Spanish than in English. Here's another trend, and we're back to the 2010 statistics. And this is an exhibit of my own creation that I used some years ago and continue to do so, because it shows a rather interesting shift. The proportion of people who are under 45 years old grew between 2000 and 2010 pretty rapidly in these cities, including Raleigh, North Carolina, where this university is, or near where this university is located. On the other hand, that same population group dropped. It didn't increase, it decreased in these locations. What do these locations up on the top have in common? What do these on the bottom have in common? And overgeneralizing perhaps, those in the top are in the Sun Belt. They are in the West and the South, and the Southwest. Down in the bottom location, we see what might be called the Rust Belt, or the where industry got started in this country, but these are the old industrial areas. Now, an occasional exception like New Orleans occurs. It's got its own set of difficulties that are due to weather and its elevation and not industrialization. Other than that, though, the locations in this panel are highly industrialized and occupied by older industries. And so what we have is people who are younger moving out of the industrialized area or the old industrialized area and into the Sun Belt, where there are new industries such as high technology and electronics. And lo and behold, folks 45 and older tend to make up a larger proportion of folks in the Rust Belt because they retire there. That's it. The young folks move out, the older folks continue in their employment in those industrial concerns to the extent that there is employment, but it's a little too late for them to migrate. Whereas in the Sun Belt, we've got a smaller portion because a larger portion of younger people have moved into that area, and a smaller proportion of folks 45 and older live there, smaller than in the Rust Belt. So once again, if you are a marketing executive, or if you're interested in advertising and media, the way in which we would conduct our marketing and advertising campaigns will differ drastically between the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt due to demographic differences, age group differences. So real quickly, we can take a look at some trends in demographics between parts of the world. Here is the birth rate. That is, and if you happen to read the legend over here, it's the number of births per 1,000 people over here on the y-axis. And all I've done is, in my numbers on the lines, have changed it to number of births per 100 people, and that enables me to report as percentages, which I think is probably a little easier to talk about. So back in 1960, worldwide 3.6%, births represented 3.6% of the population. By 1985, it was under 3%. And last year, it was, as a matter of fact, last year, it was under 2%. And we know that 2% is probably not enough to maintain population, because what we don't have on this chart is the number of folks who are dying. Anyway, here are birth rates, and the one in the upper left-hand corner is the same one we just looked at. The one in the upper right-hand corner is the United States, and you can see that its rate is lower than the world or global average, which was 1.8. At China, even lower, 1.2% today, compared to 4.3% back in 1960. What's going on? And for those of you who are students of political science, you know that a few years ago, China introduced the one-child policy. And so 1.2 births per 100, they're that's just about the one-child policy. And it's, by the way, it's picked up slightly in China, and that's because the one-child policy ended, I think, about 3 years ago. And over here in the lower right, we have almost the same picture as China getting started at 4.2%, but it has dropped less rapidly than China, and still is higher than China at about 2%. Now, there are differences in the world. Russia, incidentally, is is similar to the chart that we've looked at, charts that we just looked at, beginning at 2.5% and falling down to 1.2%. You can see that it got pretty close to 1% back in 2000. And the Russian government is actually encouraging population, trying to maintain population. We'll see what has happened as a result of this dip. And it is that Russia's population in recent years has actually declined. And here we have the Philippines at 4.2%. Just like those on the earlier charts, dropping to 2.4. Brazil 4.2 to 1.5. Nigeria 4.6 to 3.8. So 3.8% is well above the replacement, the population replacement age. Births exceed deaths. The same is true in the Philippines, and it's true in some other underdeveloped or undeveloped areas. So that's where we can expect to see population growing in the future, as opposed to Brazil or Russia or the United States or China. So see if we can move on. Brazil isn't similar to its neighbors, though. It's a little bit higher in Latin America, but it's dropped down now. Let's see, where was Brazil? Brazil ended up at 1.5%, and Latin America as a whole, 1.8%. So Brazil has made progress a little faster than its neighbors. The least developed nations started out at almost 5% in 1960. That's a lot of births. Unfortunately, there also were a lot more deaths in that region. But you can see that the birth rate still is relatively high in least developed countries at about 3.2%, higher than the replacement rate of about 2.1%. In the Middle East and North Africa, we've got something similar going on, and Sub-Saharan Africa, the same. All of them starting, and by the way, this was just a statistical fluke, but all three of these began at 4.8%. You can go to the Federal Reserve Economic Database and get the same data that I did, and you'll find this 4.8%. So all of the rates in 1960 in these charts are quite high, and the rates in least developed countries are especially high, as they are in the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's where population is going to keep growing, as opposed to in the more developed nations such as the United States and Europe and China. One of the things that you need to be aware of is that people's attitudes about families, birth rates, family formations, and so forth also have differed. Back in 2010, about a third of the population didn't have any particular opinion about alternative living arrangements, living arrangements exclusive of conventional families. And a third said made no difference, a third said was a good thing, and a third said not so good. But today, it's different. almost half think it makes no difference, and 30% still think it's a good thing. So 75% either think it's a good thing or they don't, or it doesn't matter. So generally speaking, unconventional families and living arrangements are no longer out of the mainstream. They're more acceptable. So let's take a look at how individuals are faring and economically. And this is a look at the saving rate, and it's a very recent chart. When the U.S. government dispersed its first COVID recovery assistance checks, a significant portion of the population was not needy. It didn't need those checks like others did. And so about a third of them put those checks in saving. Now, the other 2/3 needed that money and spent it right away. And because they were unemployed, we'll see in a moment that the consumer spending went down in spite of those checks, but it would have gone down a lot more if it hadn't been for those checks. And the saving rate today has come down quite a bit, although it's still a lot higher than normal. As I speak to you, the government has just passed another COVID recovery bill. And so the checks in the amount of $600 per person and $1,200 for families earning less than, I think it's 150,000, individuals, $75,000. Those people and those families will receive checks of either $600 or $1,200. That's less than the checks that were dispersed the first time, but there's already talk in Congress about increasing the disbursements to $2,000 per family, per family. So there will be. It looks like there's going to be more of these checks dispersed. Now, for some people, those are glad tidings. They're glad to hear they're going to get more free money. The problem, of course, is that the amount of money that is being put into circulation and into the economy is growing a lot faster than the growth of goods and services. And that presents some significant problems. And we'll get to those later. Some other indications of personal economic welfare. The Pew Research Group in March of 2019 did a survey and asked whether the gap between rich and poor will grow or get smaller. That is to say, whether there will be a more leveling of the population income-wise or separation. And almost 3/4 of the respondents felt that gap between the haves and the have-nots will widen. Down below the bar, we see the pie chart with people reporting expectations that their income will decline was almost half, 44%. And another 35% said that it wouldn't grow, stay about the same. If you add those up, it's 79%. And due to rounding errors, we'll have to call it 80 because 20% said that they expect their incomes to get better. And that 20% is remarkably similar to the 19% expecting the gap to get smaller. So perhaps these people who are well off and things are getting better feel that they're part of the underprivileged few and that the gap will get smaller. In any event, this is a rather odd juxtaposition of responses to the Pew survey. Now, whether these expectations come true is another matter, but if they do, if the people who answered the survey are correct about their personal outlooks, this is troubling, and it's troubling anyway because if people feel that their living conditions are getting worse, they're going to behave differently when they go into the store or shop or decide to shop than people who feel that their personal economic situation is stable and those who think it's getting better. Another interesting statistic from that same survey reported the portion of people saying that 30 years from now, adults aged 65 and older will be more or less prepared for retirement. And because costs are rising and incomes are decline when people retire, the 72% of respondents felt that seniors would be less prepared financially for retirement. And therefore, another expectation was that seniors would work beyond the age of 65 and into their 70s. And 84% of people felt that either probably or definitely that would happen. If that's true, what does that mean to people who are younger adults working? What it means is that they're going to be competing more for promotions and improvements within their employment, their corporations and their places of employment, because the old folks aren't going to move out as early. They're not going to retire and leave and make room for the new folks to come up and take their places. So you've almost got a conflict or an abrasion of generations. And so this has something to say about working conditions. Another result from the Pew research had to do with climate change. And here we can see some rather dramatic differences. All in all, about 69, almost 70% felt that they're either very worried or fairly worried about climate change. And the younger the respondents were, the more concerned they were. Rather interestingly, folks who were liberal or Democrats were much more concerned about climate change than conservatives or Republicans. Nevertheless, if you've got 38% of Republicans and almost 90%, or just about, yes, 90% of Democrats who outnumber Republicans, believing that climate change is a problem, it's reasonable to believe that you've got enough folks, about 70% and overall, that feel that climate change is a big problem. Therefore, we can anticipate that there ought to be some legislative progress in that direction. There are other preferences among liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, but where they do tend to agree more or less is on the need for better health care. 83% of Democrats, only 48% of Republicans, and a need for improving education. 2/3 of Democrats, a little more than 1/3 of Republicans. I'm an independent. I'm neither a Republican nor a Democrat. So come on and recruit me. It won't succeed. I'm a committed independent. Nevertheless, because you've got a significant enough portion of both Democrats and Republicans interested in healthcare and education, we can expect to see some progress in that direction and those directions as well. However, Republicans have to wait until they win another general election to get their way with regard to undocumented immigrants and reducing the national debt, both of which are major issues for that members of that party. Now, after the Democrats see the effects of all of these disbursements that have been made to cushion the effects of the coronavirus, the Democrats may change their mind about reducing the national debt. We'll see. So let's take a look now at some international population trends. And the first thing that everybody in my classes discovers is that when economies are measured properly, that is with purchasing power parity, rather than simply converting one nation's currency to another's using bank exchange rates. If you do that, then it looks like the Chinese population is, or the Chinese economy is smaller than the US economy. Unfortunately, I've gotten off on a tangent here because that's not what this graph is about. It's about population. And we'll get to the size of the Chinese economy later. Please pardon me for that. This graph demonstrates the fact that the population of India is rapidly catching up with the population of China, which today is over 1.3 billion and about over 1.35 billion. Because of the one-child policy and attitudes in China, which I have observed firsthand. I've visited China, and there's no doubt about it. People in China would prefer not to have large families. Until recently, there was a law, the one-child policy law, that forbade families in cities to have more than one child. Such a law doesn't exist in India, and you can see, based upon those birth rate statistics that we looked at earlier, that there's no surprise. India's population is just about to the point where it will exceed China's, and we think that'll probably happen right at the end of 2022 or early 2023. Population trends in the US and Europe growing gradually. However, in Europe, we're talking about the collection of 28 countries, but Europe's population is substantially larger than the US population. Today, the US population is about 330 million people, and Europe's is about 520 million people. Over on the right side, we see a rather interesting phenomenon that I mentioned earlier. That is that Russia's population is declining. And we saw that the birth rate in Russia is picking up because the government is actually encouraging births, seeing that with a declining population, it's going to be really difficult for the economy to grow. And that, in fact, is what seems to be happening in Japan. Japan has a declining population, and that decline is due to a variety of, or really a rather small number of cultural forces. We don't have time to get into that in this course. But for those of you who are interested in sociology and political geography, I encourage you to take a look at that trend because it's really quite something. Japan is a highly industrialized nation, has high technology, and yet its birth rate and its population is declining. And we will see quite soon that Japan's senior citizen population is also growing, but this one is for the United States. And in the US, and this chart was done in 2010, senior citizens, that is folks over 65, represented about 13%, just under that, of the US population. We'll see in later exhibits that that percentage has now grown to about 15%. So it's still rising. Seniors in the US, folks 65 years and older, are becoming a much more important demographic group. And therefore, marketing professionals need to take that into consideration. Here's the same set of statistics for the selected nations in the world. You can see up here, the very top line is represented by Japan, where we've got in 2020 about 27% of its population comprised of people 65 years or older. That is a major issue because it places a great burden on taxpayers and on the government's economy. And it's a significant issue for Japan. It's also a precursor of problems that can occur in other countries that don't come to grips with this problem of aging. This line, this brown line down here, approaching 20%, is the 15 countries in the Eurozone that use the euro as their currency. These tend to be the larger countries. The dotted black line is the US, and now, as I mentioned earlier, we're up just about 15%. And the pink squares that are rising so rapidly represent the senior citizens of Korea. The very last line is Mexico, and the reason for that country's senior citizens group to be such a small proportion is a high rate of mortality and a low life expectancy. So let's talk about life expectancy. And here, I'm just going to run through some charts very quickly. You can see that the average life expectancy in the world is about 72 years. In the US, it's more than that, but you can see it's been higher than it was most recently. For the last couple of years, it's declined. It was up around 79 and now 78 and a half. But why has it come down? And the answer is obesity and diabetes. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Notice the big difference between underdeveloped nations such as Nigeria and the more developed nations. By the way, you can see life expectancy was really low in Russia, and therefore the Russian government has paid a lot of attention. This also is partly reflective of economic conditions. It's kind of hard for people to have babies and to be healthy when the economy is not doing well. And so right here, we're at about life expectancy of 69. Down here, it was about 65, which is not very, very long life expectancy compared to the US. Today, back up to 72. So Russia's government is taking some action. China's life expectancy is not too much different from the US at 76 and a half. Brazil's 75 or 76. India, on the other hand, a lesser developed nation, less than 70, but rising. The real surprise is Japan, where life expectancy is longer than any other developed nation at about 84. That's a whole lot older than the US at 77, was it? 78. Okay, so we have the US at 78 and Japan at 84, 6 years longer. 8 years longer than China. So, in some respects, Japan has been very successful at promoting health and longevity. On the other hand, it has created economic difficulties and an overall reduction in the population. Here's the US problem. It's not just in the US, but this is a global trend in overweight and obesity. You can see that the portion of people overweight in the world today is about 40% and about 20% obese. So overweight 40, obese 20. And that has some significant health problems. Here are the rates of obesity. And where do you think it's the highest? And the answer is in the United States. And that has been rising dramatically per decade. The gray bar is 1990. The light blue bar is 2000, and the dark blue bar 2010. I don't have the data in this form yet for 2020, but as you might imagine, the trend continues. The next highest is Mexico, by the way, and it's rather interesting because those also are the two countries where consumption of carbonated beverages is the highest. So the US and Mexico, folks in those countries like carbonated beverages and sweet things. So as a result of these trends that we've looked at, we can have a look at sales, mainly retail. I think in my outline, I took off the word retail because we have some sales of non-consumer products as well. So I'll just save that little change and move on. First thing we need to appreciate is the ability of people in countries to engage in retail purchases. And an indication of that is GDP per capita. As I explained a few minutes ago, I prefer GDP per capita purchasing power parity. In China, for instance, the government maintains a low exchange rate between the currencies of the United States and China, as well as Europe and China. Why? Because China wants to export, Chinese government wants to export more. So essentially goods and or products made in China are on sale. If you convert $1,000 of US currency and go to China and obtain yuan for in order to buy things in China, you will be able to buy a lot more goods and services in China than you could with that $1,000 back in the United States. So in order to appreciate the true value of the economy in any country, we need to know what that currency can purchase in the way of actual goods and services. And thanks to work at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, we can now make that conversion. And when we do, we learn that China's economy is larger than the economy of the United States. And I think I showed that to you in a chart early on in this video. So there are a few small countries where GDP per capita is actually substantially larger than it is in the United States. But those two countries or one country in particular, Luxembourg, is quite small. It's a small principality, about like a big city in Europe. But in Luxembourg, GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis is about 170% that of the United States. So the folks in Luxembourg have the ability to purchase more expensive products than you and I do, or at least that's the tendency. GDP per capita is an indication of consumption potential, but it's not a measure of consumption potential. But it's helpful to identify where in the world consumption is likely to be most abundant. And goods and services of higher prices more likely to be consumed. So Switzerland, we see if we don't make the conversion, it's a lot higher than the US, but once we make the conversion, it's about the same as the US. Rather interesting, Ireland and Norway enjoy higher GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis than the US. Not a lot, but enough to make a difference. So contrary to popular opinion, the US isn't the world's wealthiest nation in terms of GDP per capita. But there are a lot smaller ones. And they include Japan, which we were talking about, our neighbor to the north, Canada, about the same. South Korea is in the wrong position on this chart. And that's a mistake that I made. But I left it here. I didn't change it. And the reason is that it represents a common mistake. We tend to think of Japan as a more advanced economy than others in Southeast Asia. In fact, South Korea's GDP per capita is slightly higher than Japan's. And if you remember those charts that we looked at earlier, it's probably going to exceed Japan's wealth by a lot more in the future. Then we get down, but those, if we take Canada, Japan, and South Korea, I'm sorry, disregard Canada. If we take Japan and South Korea as indicators perhaps of the Southeast Asian nations, we see about 2/3 the wealth of the U.S. And so there's plenty of purchasing power, but prices make a bigger difference there than they do in the U.S. and certainly than they do in Luxembourg. Then we get down to China, Mexico, and India. And in those cases, we have GDP per capita much lower, 27% in the case of China, 30% in the case of Mexico, and only 10% in the case of India. So Russia, I'll talk about Russia in just a minute. Mexico, our neighbor to the south, a big market, readily available, but pricing, exactly what kind of products we care to sell to Russian consumers is going to be much different than in the continental U.S. Because of the wealth effect in Mexico, and this is especially true in India. Now, the GDP per capita of China is rising. Today, on the average, it's only 27% of the U.S. But here we have to not allow ourselves to be fooled by numbers. How many people are there in China again? And the answer is about 1.2 billion. Now, about 30% of those people are in what you might call an upper income category, middle class by our standards and higher. What's 30% of 1.2 billion? 360 million. How many people total live in the US? 330 million. My God. The middle class and higher, the people who can afford to buy things in China, outnumber the entire population of the United States, and its GDP per capita on average is rising. So China is in fact a large consumer economy, but there is a large portion of China where pricing really matters, as well as preservation, for instance. Some foods have to be preserved because they can't be refrigerated in large parts of China. Russia is an enigma. It's up there. It belongs in the middle portion. You can see the way these countries are arranged is based on their GDP per capita rather than GDP per capita purchasing power parity. But when we look at Russia, we see something rather interesting, and that is that At 40%, it's getting up there with that middle group. Not up to the level of South Korea, but if you remember the chart, things are beginning to move in Russia. Russia has been penalized by sanctions imposed on it by the US and the European Union because it invaded and annexed the Crimea and invaded the Ukraine. That's another issue that I wish I could get into with you, but those sanctions have really caused Russia's economy to decline sharply and to be stagnant. Eventually, those sanctions will be lifted. And when they do, I think we will see Russia's economy pick up rather quickly. So Russia's kind of an enigma. It's down there at the lower level, but it's larger, about twice the size of the United States in land area, and has a lot of raw material, some pretty good educational systems. Russia has the potential to break out of the pack, but so far it has not done so. All right, so here's the trend of retail sales in the United States, right up to the most recent, and by that I mean December of 2020. You can see the decline that occurred due to the pandemic, and it was really severe. However, the retail sales have recovered and continue to grow because of the explosion of disbursements by the US government to offset effects of the pandemic. And you can see that apparently those disbursements have more than offset the effects of the pandemic. Here we see the same kind of phenomenon, but the recovery, nothing like that. Nevertheless, this is Europe, and we can see that the European, the Euro area, suffered the same reduction, dramatic reduction in retail sales, and has now recovered and has gotten back on a normal trajectory. Whoops. This is Mexico. I chose Mexico because we talked earlier about its GDP per capita. Remember that? And here we can see that the pandemic occurred, the pandemic effect occurred, and a recovery is occurring, but nothing like the recovery that occurred has occurred in the US and Europe. Another point just to bear in mind, and that is that the United States is a service economy. So as we look toward sales trends in the US, we want to bear in mind that demand for goods, products, is not growing as much. As a matter of fact, it's been declining as services. The demand for services has continued to grow. And yes, both of these have grown because what you see in this chart is a proportion of GDP. So about 2/3 of the GDP in the US is attributable to services, only about 20% to goods, and then another 10% or so to the government. This chart is just provides a little more detail about what was covered in the prior chart. The red line, for instance, represents the proportion of GDP contributed by manufacturing. The dark blue line at the top represents financial services, including real estate, insurance, banking, and so forth. The black line that's growing so fast and that's just caught up with manufacturing is professional services. The light blue line is really misleading, and that's agriculture. The reason I say it's misleading is because productivity of US agriculture has grown so rapidly. And when we look at agriculture worldwide, it's much more important. The short line on the right represents the information technology. What is surprising there is that the line does not grow as rapidly as expected. Now, if we were to extend that line to 2020 with the effects of the pandemic, I think we would see a sharp increase. However, the reason for the line's flatness is the fact that pricing of technology products tends to drop rapidly after a new product is developed. Think about cell phones, for instance. Okay, so we'll take a look now at some trends in retail sales. Here we have trends in e-commerce, and you can see that with people staying at home and working at home, it really shot up dramatically. As a percent of total sales, it moved from 12 to 16%. Since the pandemic occurred, it's dropped back down to a little over 14%. But clearly, e-commerce has taken a new step in its evolution. Here we have something quite different, and that is purchases of clothing. And I put that chart here for a reason, because I thought it might stimulate some conversation about the reasons for this decline. And of course, one of them is that people don't have to dress as smartly to go to the office if they're not going to the office, nor do they have to dress their kids to go to school and so forth. So if their wages have declined, if they're unemployed, of course, and they're more concerned if they're saving more, as we saw earlier, what do they decide not to spend money on? And one answer is clothing. Here we have healthcare. And I thought this was especially remarkable because we would have expected that with the coronavirus, healthcare expenditures would have really gone up. Certainly occupancy in healthcare facilities has gone up, but many of those services are either priced low or have to be paid for by some form of welfare. The pricing is just lower. So expenditures for elective surgery, for instance, much lower. And you can see that the recovery, even after the peak of the pandemic, has not returned to normal. So although healthcare facilities are much busier, they are not as well off financially. That's a real issue. Here we have the employment in the healthcare industry, and you can see the same trend, getting better, but certainly not back to where it used to be. This is an indication of how trends in age groups and aging can affect markets. So here is a product category unique to senior citizens, or essentially unique to senior citizens. The numbers on this chart represent annual rates of growth. And by and large, those are pretty good growth rates, faster than the economy as a whole, for sure. The red part of the bars represent purchases or payments by the Veterans Administration, and the other simply commercial transactions. And you can see again that when people decided to save more, spend less, were more concerned, and or unemployed, consumption of this product category really dropped. Look at the second quarter of the current year, really dropped dramatically. It's picked back up, but still lower than the same time last year. So if you read the comments at the bottom, you will see that the second quarter drop was about 59%. And for the full year, there's going to be a substantial decrease in that industry, after which it'll probably get back up to that normal trend. Here are sales in grocery stores, and you can see there was a big pickup in the second quarter of the current year. Why is that? People staying at home. Maybe they didn't want to stay at home, but that's what they were doing in the lockdowns. Grocery store sales, declined after the peak of the pandemic, but you can see that they did not get down to normal, and in fact, most recently have begun to pick up again as a second wave of the pandemic seems to be occurring. More lockdowns. However, while they're home, you've got nothing better to do, might as well have a beer or something stronger. So here you can see that the consumption of libations in the United States has not suffered like groceries, has not suffered, like employment or healthcare. Food and service establishments, restaurants and bars did suffer a tremendous decline. So although the people aren't drinking at bars, they are drinking at home. Anyway, that's picked up a little bit too, but again, due to the new lockdowns, you can see that bars and restaurants sales have turned down again. Of course, it's very hard for people in cities to eat outside on the restaurant patios when it's snowing. Here we have trends in auto sales, and boy, auto sales really took a dive as well, didn't they? However, now they've picked up again. So the auto industry and people's purchases of autos indeed are right back to normal, if not higher. Why would that be? Well, among other things, they're not getting on buses or taking taxis or trains into the city to commute to work, are they? And of course, they've got those big savings that they've piled up, and interest rates are at all-time lows. So if ever there were a good time for people who have those savings that they're piling up to buy a car, this is it. They can use their savings, and the interest rates on their auto loans will be lower. And that seems to be why this chart has exploded the way it has. Um, Here are the number of vehicles registered in the US. This is great news for auto repair stores and companies that make products for cars, including repair parts. However, as we said, people are not driving to work as much, and we see what the impact on gasoline sales has been. Now, part of this, of course, is due to the lower prices of gasoline. They have dropped substantially due to lower demand and higher production. So there's a lot of surplus oil and gasoline in the world, and that pushes prices down. So physical consumption and pricing both are making this chart behave the way it is. In fact, here's what's been happening to gasoline prices. And you can see some similarity between these two charts, can't you? But in any event, gasoline prices certainly have come down recently. You can see most recently there's been a little spike up, but we're still, if you're a consumer, you're still a happier purchaser of gasoline when you go to the filling station than you were back when prices were $4 a gallon. So the chart in the upper left-hand corner is the same one that we're looking at. It's just standardized at 100. And here are some other indications of pricing. So public transportation, as you can see, has really dropped because demand is lower. And so cities and municipalities are doing what they can to make it easier for people to get on the bus, but that's not what they're doing. Food prices, on the other hand, since grocery stores are so busy, food prices are up. That's a simple supply and demand thing. And the prices for homes have increased quite steadily and did not drop during the pandemic because, among other things, there was a trend in some cities to move out of the city. So what kind of conclusions can we now draw about retail sales? And I'll start with industries. Whoops, I went a little too far, didn't I? I sure did. I must have hit the wrong button. Gasoline stations, gas prices, the trend charts we looked at. Here are prices for medical care. New cars, the prices have sort of flattened. Home rental prices have increased because people continue to surpass the age of adulthood, and prices for new cars and excluding trucks have stayed pretty much the same during the past few years. So the top chart is for cars and trucks. The bottom chart is just for cars. Some differences, but not much. This is a chart that always gets attention. These are rates of price increases from 1998. And you can see that hospital services, college tuition, college textbooks, to a somewhat lesser degree recently, and medical care all are more expensive today than they were back in 1998 or even 2008. Those areas, those categories of services and products are rising faster than average hourly wages, aren't they? We can see that the average hourly wages are not rising have not risen as fast as prices for childcare, medical care, college tuition, and hospital services. Um, but they have grown just a little bit faster than the price for housing and food. Not a lot, but a little. Um, the average growth over in prices and wages over and wages are a price, aren't they? They're the price for labor. But the average price increase since 1998, which is what, about 20 years, has been 60%. But you can see up here, when we're talking about hospital services, it's more like 250%. College tuition, maybe 180%. Medical care, 150%, and so forth. New cars have dropped in their prices a little bit. Clothing, as we noted earlier, a little bit. Cell phone services have dropped a lot, maybe 40% or even more. Computer software, toys, and TVs especially. Why? Because TVs, cell phones, and so forth are made in Asia, where hourly labor rates are lower, right? So here we have then consumer price trends. And so during the last 22 years, the 60% increase on the average has occurred, but healthcare and education faster, technology products such as telephones and televisions, computer software, more affordable because they're produced in Asia. Another item that seems to be the case is the more involvement of government in regulation, approvals of price of manufacturing methods and so forth. To the extent that government is involved, price increases are higher. Manufactured goods, again, because they are often made outside offshore, have tended to increase more slowly or actually decrease. And of course, to the extent that there is international competition, prices decrease faster. So here we have the trend in housing starts, the production of homes. And you can see that they've increased recently, but they haven't gotten up to historic rates. And spending, however, for construction rather, residential construction did decrease during the pandemic, but picked up again and is now higher than ever. So although construction may be lower than it was in the past, the pricing is probably higher simply because the total spending has gone up faster than housing starts. Here we have the production. By the way, if you haven't figured it out, we've moved beyond consumer products and we're now into industrial products such as construction, and in this case, semiconductors. And the blue line represents production or rather the sales of semiconductors. And you can see that they've grown from about 10 billion to 40 billion. So since 2001, they've grown for about 400%. So semiconductors, a very large attractive industry. Recently, the growth rate in semiconductors has declined, but you can see in the red line that semiconductor growth rates are very volatile. So very quickly, the last item we need to look at is the US government as a market, and also as a source of expenditures. And it's important to look at this because, as you can see, in 2020, the US government spent $3 trillion, 3,132 billion, $3.132 trillion more than its income. The deficit was 50% of the spending. Spending was twice as great as income, so that the deficit today is about $27 trillion, and that's a lot higher than GDP of about $21 trillion. So we've got a problem. Not only that, we know that, if you recall, there are additional disbursements underway to offset effects of the pandemic. So the blue bar on the right will be about the same in 2021, probably a little bit lower, but it's still going to be higher than normal. So here's the explanation that you already knew, and it's for welfare, or at least this is one of the reasons for that large deficit. And all total, we're looking at something just about $2 trillion. And you may notice down at the bottom that in fiscal 2021, it was anticipated that the spending for welfare would drop back down to 1.1, about where it was in 2019. Based upon more recent developments, that is unlikely. It's probably going to be closer to $1.3 trillion, or maybe even a little higher. Here's the trend in defense spending by the government, and you need to pay close attention to the colors. Only the blue bars are represent Defense Department expenditures for conventional military purposes. The red bars represent welfare paid to veterans. The green bars represent, and the white bars represent disbursements to foreign governments. One of those bars is to support foreign military. But if we put it all together, we really don't see expenditures for conventional warfighting purposes getting over $128 billion. I'm sorry, $828 billion. That may seem like a lot, but if you recall that the world is a very tense place today, with lots of conflict going on, many military threats, including new ones that we haven't dealt with in the past, such as bio warfare. We may not have enough money in this category, and yet we've got those big deficits, don't we? So where will the government take money out of the budget in order to make their payments on all those debts? Sometimes it comes from this category, and to the extent that that is the case, and you can see that that was the case between 2010 and 2016. So there's a real question as to whether that's going to happen again. I hope it won't, because I think this nation needs to defend itself. So here are a few of the federal deficits. We've already stated that last year. Oh, by the way, the fiscal year of the US government ends on October 1st, essentially September 30th, but for accounting purposes, I believe it's October 1st. In any event, you can see that last fiscal year, ending September 30, was $3.1 trillion deficit. And the other bars represent deficits in prior years. They're all deficits. They all represent spending in excess of income. And so this is a chart that represents the type of debt that the federal government presently owes. The blue bar represents federal debt bought by the Federal Reserve. So it's just a way of creating money. But it's debt. It's debt that the US government owes the Federal Reserve. Debt held by the federal government as IOUs for Social Security. In other words, Social Security payments come in from your payroll stubs and my payroll deductions, and it's turned over to the government. And so the government owes the Social Security fund the amount that you see in the red wedge. And you can see that that's a pretty substantial amount. And frankly, it's kind of difficult to imagine how that gets paid back. So the real debt payable is in the green wedge. And you can see it's the highest and it's growing the fastest. And that's debt in the public hands, including debt held by the Federal Reserve, as well as you and me if we buy federal bonds, federal notes, and so forth. But you can see that it's quite large and growing very rapidly. In fact, total debt of the federal government is now something like 130% of GDP. The last time that occurred was during World War II. So at this point, we've got total federal debt in 2020. And the end of federal fiscal 2020, we just saw it was about 26.9 trillion. By December 23 of the year that I'm making this video, Christmas time, it had grown to 27.5 trillion. And for fiscal 2021, ending October 1st of 2021, it's expected to reach 28.2 trillion. And that's before the additional disbursements for pandemic adjustments are made. So it's easy to see that debt reaching 29 trillion or more. So as a percent of GDP, you can see that at the end of fiscal 2020, Federal debt was 121% of GDP, but as I mentioned, we're now approaching 130%. So let's summarize. I'm sure you'll be glad that since it's as late as it is, about 70% of the US economy consists of consumer spending. So a majority of these observations have been focused on that sector. The consumer sector consists of people. So to understand market potentials, we must understand population. And so we've talked about China and India, each of which has about 1.4 billion people or more. Now I think I'm going to change that right now to 1.4 because we're not to 1.5 yet. Within the next 3 years, India's population will reach 1.5 billion and it surpassed China's. But because of differences in the quality of their economies, China today is the growth market of the present. India will be the growth market of the future, but it has to solve a lot of political and economic problems. Populations of Japan and Russia, you may recall, are declining. And populations of wealthier nations are not growing nearly as fast. Although the United States and Europe enjoy populations that are growing due to immigration, but that creates brand new problems and challenges for marketing professionals. Indeed, immigration is the most important reason for US population growth, or at least it will be very soon. And the largest immigration group by far is made of Hispanics, which today represent almost 19% of the US population. By 2030, 21%, and probably more. In fact, as this process goes on, by 2045, Caucasians, whites, will represent less than 50% of the total US population. And among youth aged 18 or younger, the proportion represented by white people already is below 50%. As we mentioned, the largest communities of Hispanic people are in California, Texas, and Florida. So if you're trying to sell products or services in those states, and frankly, several others, you probably need to be able to do it in Spanish language and appeal to Hispanic tastes and culture. So the world's population, as we observed, is growing older, especially in developed nations. As we saw, 27% of Japan's population is 65 or older, 20% in Europe, 15% in the US, and that portion is rising. Life expectancy also is increasing in developed nations. In Japan, it's 84 years, 78 in the US, 76 in China. On the other hand, it's a lot less in lesser developed nations, such as Nigeria. Actually, the US life expectancy dropped in the past 2 years due to high rates of obesity and diabetes. And so we can expect that those conditions will be the subjects of a great deal of medical research and pharmaceutical product development. Um, Rather interesting statistics about aging. Today, about 90,000 people are 100 years old or older. By 2030, that'll be 130,000. And by 2060, 600,000. And because senior citizens tend to vote more than other groups, and because their proportions of the population are rising so fast, um, we can expect the government to be especially responsive to that age group. Incidentally, if I didn't mention it, the people that I talked about that are going to grow to 600,000 are people who are 100 years old or older. I'm not sure I mentioned that, but these folks are really old, and yet as time passes, 100 will be the new 85 or something like that. If we just take a look at advertising in media, we see already that marketers are and businesses are beginning to appeal more and more to senior citizens, whether it's in the production of new medicines, medical appliances, of which there are many, retirement communities, specialized pharmaceuticals, hearing aids, and so forth. These are all growing industries. So what about families and family formation? How do we see them as markets? And quite amazingly, marriage rates are declining steadily around the world. And we saw that in charts for the US, Europe, and China. Today, only about 52% of adults are married, 42% unmarried, 6% widows. About a third of respondents to a Pew Research Center survey gave the opinion that marriage is now obsolete. What does that say to us about marketing and the way and the kind of products that we make? But clearly, we're more interested today in producing products for unmarried people, singles, or people who live in alternative arrangements. In fact, 75% of respondents didn't care what kind of living arrangement their peers lived in, whether it was a conventional family or some other arrangement. Birth rates worldwide are falling. And again, we looked at some charts that reflected those trends, but we also saw that in less developed regions of Africa and the Middle East, birth rates are still above the replacement age. And so that's where population growth is occurring in those regions where economic conditions are not as favorable. So they're growing, but as targets of marketing opportunity, they are not as attractive. So demand for conventional single-family homes, maybe not as great in the future, in this country anyway, as in the past, because fewer people are married. Instead, we can expect to see greater demand for multifamily structures, such as apartments and condominiums. There we should see some pretty significant increases. Services for singles will also grow in popularity. There's an advertisement on television right now. I don't know if you've seen it, but a delivery man comes to the home of these two people who are living together. And the lady takes the package into a table in the house, and opens it up, and it's a meal. It's a prepared meal, and looks pretty good. And she takes it out of the box, and it's in a nice setting, and she starts eating it, and she looks, and obviously she likes it. And then she gets this amazed look on her face, and she calls out, "We don't have to cook anymore." And she says it again, and her living partner comes into the room and also expresses a gasp of delight that they don't have to cook anymore. So I think we can guess that the demand for prepared meals is rising. Okay, how about people's individual economic conditions? How are those changing? And what we see is, as that one chart on differences between the haves and the have-nots, the higher between income groups widens, and as the per capita GDP, that is the tendency to consumption potentials differ between nations, that marketing strategies are going to have to employ both low cost and differentiation approaches. In countries and market segments where incomes are high, living conditions are good, differentiation, offering a better quality product, added services and so forth will be indicated. On the other hand, in countries such as China and India, and lesser developed nations, that is less likely to be the case. In the United States, social attitudes recently have grown more pessimistic, as we saw. Some 73% said that the gap between rich and poor is growing. 44% reported they expect their living conditions to grow worse. 72% reported a belief that senior citizens will not be sufficiently prepared to retire. And more than that, expressed the opinion that as time passes, seniors will have to work into their 70s. And as I pointed out, that probably will create a generation conflict, because the longer seniors stay employed in corporations, the less room there is for younger professionals to move into their jobs if they have higher responsibility. So with regard to public policy, we noticed that both Democrats and Republicans seem to recognize that healthcare and education are high priorities, and they agree that climate change is a major public issue. So those are the three topics where we might expect some near-term legislative progress. On the other hand, we noticed something else, and that is that there's been an internal migration in the United States. Do you recall that one? People were moving from the north to the east, the north and the east, to the south and the west. And as a result, we saw that that this, or not as a result, but the cause of that movement was the evolution of new industries in the Sun Belt. The result is that there is now a higher concentration of older people in the north and the east because they're not moving. On the other hand, a higher concentration of younger people in the south and the west because they are. And these trends will indeed influence growth of construction, of retailing, establishment, as well as the products that retail establishments sell. And it certainly will also influence construction trends. So off we go to sales trends. And you may recall that I adjusted that from retail to just sales trends because we talk about something a little more than just consumer. Nevertheless, a very important fact that we have to deal with is that there is pent-up demand today. As the federal government disperses recovery checks, which it's still doing, a significant portion of the people who receive those checks put them in savings rather than spend them right away. As a result, there is pent-up demand for discretionary consumer products. And we're seeing that in purchases of cars and homes. However, the outlook for recovery from the pandemic is uncertain at best. And that's because the US, even when the vaccination program has been implemented, people in the US will be subject to, even if many are immune, they'll be confronted with people and products that come to us from other countries. Where vaccinations aren't as complete, or where variations of the coronavirus occur. So to the extent that we deal with people who are not as well protected as we are, we're subject to the viruses that they bring with them. The result of this situation probably will be modification of supply chains with greater emphasis on national and regional sources as opposed to the globalization trend that we read about in our textbooks today. So, what industries and what product lines are looking best? Food products, clearly. Agriculture, food products, food packaging, food retailing, prepared meals, but no reduction was seen in the chart for those products for groceries and the like. As a matter of fact, the reverse. Healthcare, without a doubt. Medical equipment, health services, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, a new category that has not received very much emphasis until quite recently. Senior citizen services and products. Technology, we're all familiar with what's been going on in that category. Home products, because we're staying at home more, there's probably more demand for products that we use at home. However, the gap between income groups is still widening. And so the greatest growth probably will be in the so-called dollar stores and discount retailers such as Walmart. Power sources are changing. Natural gas and solar power are going to, over time, replace some, but not all, of oil and gasoline. Eventually, we're going to even have cars powered by electric engines, right? And that will be especially the case in China, India, and Southeast Asian nations. One other category that is probably going to continue to grow, regrettably but necessarily, is defense products, especially homeland defense products and products that protect us from biowarfare. It's turned out to be a lot easier for biological contaminants to get into a country than we thought previously, and we're going to have to deal with that risk now. Here we have a few areas where the outlook isn't as favorable. Industrial and commercial construction, that is building of offices and factories, probably not looking as good as in the past because we're, among other things, moving out of cities. We're working at home. And to make matters worse, the amount of industrial capacity that we already have greatly exceeds demand. Something on the order of 75% capacity utilization on average, although of course that differs by industry. For instance, electric utilities capacity utilization is much higher than that. Industries based on public gatherings, restaurants, theaters, office buildings. Yes, we will all hopefully get vaccinated, but we're also aware that there is risk in public gatherings, and it's going to be a long time until we want to go back to those places. And so they are certainly not growth industries any longer. Airlines, manufacturers of commercial aircraft as opposed to military aircraft, and mass transit, all are in a severe recession because of the coronavirus. Eventually, they should recover, but it will be a long time until they're back to what we consider to be normal. Another small industry that we picked up on in the charts was clothing for work and school. If you don't need it, you don't buy it. Local and regional banks that depend on difference between the interest that they have to pay the Federal Reserve or bonds and the interest that they charge you for loans, that difference is very narrow. That's because there's so much money out there that interest rates everywhere are lower, very low. So it's difficult for a local bank or even a regional bank to make a profit between the cost of their funds and the interest rates that they charge. If a bank can charge fees for services, investment services, and a variety of other services that banks provide, those banks can do okay. But those that depend upon interest rate spreads have a problem. And in fact, every year we see, give or take, 20 banks go out of business. There are so many small banks in the United States. And before the pandemic, they were having trouble getting by. So today, even more. Some markets in the world are more attractive than others. As we've observed, China, countries in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, South Korea, and India, all are expected to grow rapidly. Although in the case of India, while it's growing rapidly, It's growing from a very low base. The consumer markets are there, but you've got to sell things at low prices. Larger economies are in more highly developed, mature nations, such as in Northern Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, Southern Europe, and of course the United States. So here we don't expect rapid growth, but we do expect stability. Stability at a time like this can be attractive. And then there are regions where there is slow growth or no growth, such as Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe, Mexico, and don't forget Russia and Japan, where the population is declining. One final observation, that is, there's been an economic shift from the Western to the Eastern Hemisphere. And market potentials will differ and are differing substantially between those two parts of the world. Economic growth is occurring in the Orient, in China, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and India. And so if we're doing strategic planning, we have to look toward those areas, those countries, for marketing potential. Now, there's another characteristic of that trend, and that is that military power tends to parallel economic power. So to the extent that some areas grow economically, they're able to produce more military goods and equipment and systems and services. So the US is now in a new situation where it is no longer significantly above the others. Instead, they've come up, and we're in a new world. You, as a manager of companies of a company in this new world, will have to make assumptions and plan in ways that I did not have to when I was a vice president of corporate planning at a New York Stock Exchange company, PepsiCo, or when I was advising managers in strategic planning of corporations around the world. Your deal is different, and it's my hope that this very long video has provided you with good knowledge about the kinds of adjustments that you are going to have to make. So with that, I hope you've taken a break during this long video so that otherwise, as I speak to you now, you're probably asleep. But if you're not, and even if you are, I wish you goodbye.